Chess friends, hope you are doing well. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'll be showcasing an amazing and extraordinary chess match between Torch and myself. In this game, I played as the black pieces and made a daring sacrifice of my bishop to launch a fierce attack on the king side. This game is packed with tactical maneuvers and strategic plays that you're sure to enjoy. Let's dive right in without further delay. Torch started the game with e4, which is a highly popular move. This move allows the knight to jump into the game right away, and you can choose to play the bishop opening, the Ruy Lopez, or have another knight go to f3. c3 d4 is also popular. However, after a few moves, I chose to play knight to c6, anticipating the bishop on c5 after d6. From the white perspective, there are various options such as playing c3, d4, bringing the knight out to c3, placing the bishop on b5, or opting for bishop to c4. However, in this case, white chose to play the Ruy Lopez. After a few moves, white played d3, which opens up the bishop's diagonal. Now, white can choose to place the bishop on g5 or e3 square, or even move the knight to c3 to put pressure on the knight by playing knight to d5 and pinning the knight if you move out your bishop and shut down the gate with d6. After bishop c5, you might be tempted to capture the pawn on e5 by removing my knight. However, if you dare to do so, then after knight takes e5, I can play queen to d4, simultaneously attacking your vulnerable f2 pawn and the knight. This would result in losing a piece for you. So instead, he opted not to capture the knight and played a powerful move, pawn to c3. This move aims to advance the pawn to d4, allowing Torch to move his knight from d2 and potentially maneuver it to e3. Alternatively, you could push your queenside pawns more aggressively, as facilitated by playing pawn to c3, after both side castled. I played d6. At this point, some players might consider capturing the knight, while others may think of playing bishop to g5 or developing their knight by playing knight to d2. However, these moves could create a vulnerable situation because after a few moves, I could play the powerful and sneaky move of moving my knight to g4, directly attacking the pawn on f2. Moving the rook to f1 would passivate your rook. If you choose to play rook to e2 to protect the pawn, I can respond with the cunning move of pawn to f5. This aggressive move of pawn to f5 and knight to g4 puts pressure on your position, allowing my bishop to potentially control the f5 square and central squares. Instead, Torch decided to play h3 to prevent my knight from entering g4. Consequently, I responded by playing knight to e7 immediately, which facilitates the move to push my c-pawn, displacing your bishop and maneuvering my knight to f4 through knight g6. In this video, I'll demonstrate how to apply pressure to the king's structure, with the potential for my bishop to sacrifice itself on h3. Torch responded by immediately counterattacking with pawn to d4. If I were to retreat my bishop, Torch could further control the center by moving his rook to e1, creating significant pressure. Instead, I chose to counterattack by pushing my c-pawn, putting both bishops in a precarious position. If you capture my bishop, I'll reciprocate. Despite the capture, the d6 pawn initially seems strong, but once my knight moves, you'll need to protect the pawn. After rook moves to safeguard the pawn, bishop e6 and queen infiltration occur, and after a couple of moves later. Subsequently, white threatens bishop c5, aiming to attack my queen with pawn to d7. However, I can counter by moving my queen and securing my position with rook to c8, creating a formidable setup. In a previous move, I played bishop to e6 and queen to d7, setting up a queen-bishop battery for a potential attack on the king side, including the possibility of sacrificing the bishop on h3 as previously mentioned. After the knight moves to f4, threatening the queen, and the queen moves to d2. A spectacular and cunning move arises. Queen takes h3, leading to checkmate in one move and ending the game decisively. Returning to the position, capturing the bishop with pawn creates a disadvantageous move for you, and after a few moves we've seen exchanges in the center, with the knight capturing the e5 pawn. In this position, I encourage you to pause the video and consider the best move for black. I refrained from playing any queen or bishop moves to avoid creating advantageous circumstances for white. Instead, I executed a brilliant move, bishop takes h3, sacrificing the bishop immediately. Capturing the bishop would leave white's king in a vulnerable position due to my bishop controlling the diagonal, allowing me to move my queen to b8 to exert further control. White's optimal response would be bishop to a4 to protect the knight, but I could escalate the pressure on the knight by moving my bishop to c7. If white moves the knight back to c4 to intensify the pressure on the bishop, I can execute the cunning move queen to g3, pinning the pawn to the king. Subsequently, after a sequence of checks, I can deliver checkmate with knight to g4, with the pawn pinned and the king exposed. There's little chance of safeguarding the king. In the actual game, white opted for knight to c4 to attack the bishop, and I responded with bishop to g4 as a tempo on the queen. This maneuver pinned the pawn to the king, restricting its movement. After the queen moves and the knight lands on g6, you might be tempted to play rook to e1, bishop to g5, or move the knight to d2 to develop your pieces. However, if you choose to move your knight to d2 to develop it, be cautious of a tactical move, knight to f4, attacking the bishop with 3 pieces simultaneously, creating vulnerability around your king's side. In response, you could play knight to e5, putting pressure on my bishop and attempting to protect your bishop. Nevertheless, after I capture the piece on d3, and regardless of how you recapture the knight, you risk losing a piece after I play bishop to e2, exerting pressure on both the knight and the rook. This would lead to a devastating situation for you. And let me tell you a quote about life. A man too busy to take care of his health is like a mechanic too busy to take care of his tools. Returning to the current position, we see the move knight to d2. However, Torch opted to play more aggressively by capturing the bishop with the knight, eliminating the threat from this strong diagonal. Following this, white played pawn to f3 to prevent a heavy attack along this dark square diagonal, now that the bishop is no longer there. Subsequently, after the bishop and queen moves, we see the queen aiming to control the dark squares on the king's side, potentially allowing the knight to come to h5 and assert control. Despite these defensive moves, the bishop may still pose a threat on the g5 square. If you haven't discovered the brilliant move from the previous variation, which was bishop takes h3, here's another opportunity to find the best move for black. Try to figure out the best move for black and write down your answer in the comments why you want to play that move. Now, in this position, it's not a typical knight move or straightforward move but requires positional understanding. The move is to bring your rook to the a5 square. Why? Because positioning the rook on a5 allows it to potentially swing over to h5, gaining control of that file alongside the queen on c7. If white decides to bring out the bishop to e3, aiming to attack the b6 pawn and potentially create vulnerability on the queen side, I can counter by moving the rook all the way to h5, exploiting a potential weakness in your position. Subsequently, if moves like f4 are played to block the queen's diagonal, I can apply emergent pressure. This pressure arises because after your pawn moves to f4, it loses control over the g4 square, allowing my knight to smoothly move into g4 and establish a winning position. After the queen moves to e7, positioning itself to potentially target the h4 square and launch a strong attack alongside the queen. Rook on d8, white may need to play g3 to protect that square. However, a cunning move would be rook to h3, attacking white's pawn. White cannot defend the pawn with queen to g2 because the bishop would be hanging there. Similarly, if white plays king to g2, rook to h2 wins the queen immediately. Instead, a strong move for white would be to move the rook to f3, protecting the pawn and fortifying the position. Now, let's consider the position again. Here I can play the stunning move knight to h4, pressuring the rook but sacrificing the knight in the process. Capturing it would lead to a strong response. After the exchange, I can capture the pawn on h4, intensifying the pressure on the white king, with the rook on d8 controlling d5, and after the knight moves to activate the rook, I can deliver a powerful check with queen to h2, following knight takes e3, further pressuring the vulnerable king. A capture would result in bishop h3, delivering a devastating check. After the king moves, queen h8 check, and the king has very few squares to move. The sequence continues with bishop checks, forcing the king to move. And finally, The rook joins the attack on d2, exerting a heavy attack on the king side. You can see that there are no pawns to safeguard his position. After the bishop moves to the d1 square to attack the bishop, I can even play the move rook to g2, creating a situation where it can be checkmate by playing queen to h1, resulting in a complete victory for me. So returning to the position, we have seen bishop to e3. And even the consideration of playing knight to a3 may seem reasonable but are ultimately ineffective if you don't find the best move. Torch discovered the best move by playing pawn to e5, exerting pressure on the knight on h6, potentially creating a devastating situation for black's kingside. After the pawn captures, Torch immediately took my knight on the g6 square, as the knight plays a significant role in launching a heavy attack on the kingside. However, before I captured the bishop on g6, I made a daring move by playing bishop to c4, attacking the rook. If you choose to move your rook to avoid the attack on the bishop. Since the rook cannot move to d1, I can capture your bishop and form a queen-bishop battery by playing queen to e7, exerting pressure along this file on the rook. Following the capture exchange sequence, you may be tempted to capture my bishop on c4 square. However, a wonderful move is available to me, rook to d1, creating a situation where your king is completely vulnerable. You'll need to block the check by moving your queen to the f1 square, but this would result in losing your queen. Considering the position again, any rook move will pose problems for the white king. After the knight moves to d2 to maintain pressure against the bishop and captures occur in the game, we can see that the knight on f1 is controlling the h2 and g3 squares. Subsequently, after captures occur in the game, you can observe that Torch has effectively neutralized all my attacking chances and opportunities with his strategic play. The possibility of the rook going to the h5 square to launch a heavy attack alongside the queen is no longer viable because Torch has countered that move. And the knight cannot establish a strong outpost in that square. Instead, Torch made an interesting move by bringing his bishop to the f4 square, pinning down the rook to the queen. He is playing very well, but I am Stockfish, Superman in chess, and he is just a mosquito in front of me. I played an even stronger move than him, pawn to b5, and you might be wondering why this move was played. Actually, it is a waiting move because black tempted white to commit his rook to the e1 square to increase the pressure against this rook, and if you ever make this rook move, then I can easily capture your rook and sacrifice my queen right away to double up my rooks on this first rank. You can see that there is no way to protect your knight, so after the bishop moves, captures happen in the game. I win your queen right away. And you can see that this endgame is very winning for me because I have an extra pawn and the knight is completely superior to the bishop. But don't worry, when Stockfish is here, let me inspire you by making a quote. Never waste your time trying to explain yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. So going back to the position, white decided to move the a-pawn to counterplay on the queen side. However, after I captured the pawn, he didn't capture it right away because he had a strategic maneuver. He executed a strong strategic maneuver by capturing the piece on e5 and immediately playing his queen to the b6 square to put pressure on the structure and the rook. After my queen moved to the e7 square, he then captured the pawn on a4 to exert pressure and play rook a7 to pressure the 7th rank. This was his strategic maneuver. A few moves later, I declined a queen exchange when he played queen to e4 and then declined a rook exchange when he played rook to d4. After a couple more moves, he created a queen-rook battery along this file, but my position was well protected by my pieces. I moved my rook to the a8 square to activate it in this file and exerted pressure by playing rook to a1. A few moves later, I moved my rook to the a5 square to pressure by playing rook to e5, supported by the queen, and planned to bring the knight to the d5 square with potential activation of my queen on e7 and create a queen-rook battery. After some more moves, I played pawn to b5, with pawn to c5 coming next to overwhelm your rook position in the center. After a few more moves, I played pawn to c5, and when the queen moved to the f7 square, I executed my strategic maneuver by placing my queen on the f7 square. This move was tricky because after you played pawn to b4, I could exert pressure by playing knight to e4, creating a family fork on the queen, rook, and king because the pawn was pinned to the king. After the king moves back to safeguard his position, you can see that I can play queen to e7 to exert pressure against this knight. After the rook moves, I play queen to e8 to pressure the knight further. If you dare to move your knight to protect itself, then I will gain control of the open file, where my rook can swing into the file by playing rook to e2. After the queen moves, I can play pawn to h4. This pawn move to h4 is very tricky, as it gives the opportunity for the knight to plant itself on g3 through the knight on h5 square. So, after the rook moves, and I capture your knight on c2, I can give you a check, forcing the king to move out to h2, then, I can provide another check by placing my queen on the e5 square, winning your rook back. So, going back to the key position, when white made his move, king to f2, then you can see that my knight can exert pressure by playing knight to e4, if your knight ever dares to move. I will gain control of the open file. Here, I played a strategic maneuver by placing my pawn on h4 to create an outpost on the g3 square for my knight or queen, potentially exposing a weakness in your position. So, after a couple of moves, when the knight moves back and I play pawn to c4, the best move for white would have been to play queen to g5 to maintain strong pressure around my king's structure and the king side. However, he made a blunder move by playing rook to b7, as this move is a blunder. I can gain tempo on the rook by placing my queen on c6, and after the rook moves, I can gain another tempo by placing my rook on d6. Now, your queen has to move, and I can gain a third tempo on your position by placing my queen on b6, targeting the rook with a check. So you have to play queen to e3 to block the check. Here, I execute a brilliant sacrifice of my knight by placing it on g4. I sacrificed my bishop in the opening, and now I'm sacrificing my knight even further. You have to capture the knight because you have no other choice. After the rook moves to the f6 square to give a check, the king moves to the e2 square. Here, I can play the astonishing move, rook to e6, to exert pressure against your queen and king. Going back to the key position, it all started, after you made a blunder move. Instead of playing queen to g5, you made the rubbish move of rook to e7. Here, I have the potential chance to place my queen, and after a few moves, I achieve a favorable position after moving my rook to the f6 square. You can see that your position is completely vulnerable. I can even make a potential advancement in my evaluation by capturing a pawn, but after the king moves back, the rook comes in, and captures happen in the game. I play queen to d6, and this position is completely winning for me because you only have a knight and a rook, while I have my queen, more aggressive pawns. After a few moves, I play queen to g5 check, but I'm fast forwarding the game, because it is completely winning. Although black has no counterplay, they are restricted to safeguarding their king's position, and it's just completely over. A few moves later, I push my h-pawn and win the knight. At the end of the day, it's rooks versus the queen. And after giving a series of checks, I pick up the rook on the b5 square, move out the king and queen, and deliver checkmate. What an astonishing and brilliant game. It was a very amazing chess game that I played in my recent tournament. You know what? Life is very crazy when you sacrifice a piece. In this position, I sacrificed my bishop on the h3 square, and later played an even stronger move by placing my rook on a5 for a strategic maneuver. It was a very strategic and tactical game. You can analyze the whole game. I will put the page link in the description. If you enjoyed my video, don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. Wish you all the best. Thanks for watching.